Hello, welcome back to our discussion of CSS Lectures. So last time we went over font family and we saw how fonts were inherited. This time we'll look at the paragraph tag here. Again, this is an element selector just like this was. So the element without decoration in front is an element selector. Begin curly brace, end curly brace defines the rule set, and then you have individual rules in here. And here we set the border style to solid and the width to 50%. So that accounts for why we have 50% of the container here used and the other part blank. The border style is solid, and you can see on paragraphs. So every paragraph we have in the HTML file has a border style. Now the border style is not inherited. And as students of programming languages, we often want to go to, well, what's the principle of that? How can I see that from this definition that it's not inherited? And the answer is it's not really an overarching principle applied here. This is a use case decision. So when you define a font family for a parent element, you want that font family in the general rule to be inherited all the way down, because you don't want to use more than 2 or 3 fonts. So if the font family is set for the parent element, that font family is carried down. Whereas if you inherit, let's say, this border style element of solid, and remember, the HTML is structured to be a containment structure with elements inside other elements. So if that was an inherited style, think about what would happen. Every child element within the parent element that defined a border style would have a box around it, a border around it. So if you had other things nested inside these paragraphs, as we see here, actually, those would inherit the border style. Now this one does, but I've actually changed the CSS markup and the HTML markup a little bit to make that happen. So in general, inherited properties are properties that, by judgment and judgment alone, the CSS committee thought should be inherited, and styles that aren't inherited are ones where you think that because the particular element that it's calling out just looks better if it's mostly on the parent, and you can overcome that, by the way, both behaviors by some CSS markup. We actually see on the very next line, on line 43 of the CSS, where this border comes from, and we'll look at the HTML in a minute. But this is a class selector, so it begins with a period, and then inherit border, and then that's a selector of a class. So now we know and that says border style inherit. So border styles aren't inherited by default, but if you do border style inherit, then you will inherit the border style, and that's what's happening here. In a moment we'll see this, the HTML markup that achieves that. So from a class selector, our next example is a ID selector, and the ID selector is demarked with a pound sign at the beginning and then the specific ID. Remember that classes can be used multiple times, so they can be a more general selector than an ID, which should be limited to one element on the page. So the ID is unique. So this is calling out the ridge border style, and that's where we see this here. So when we look at the HTML, we should see an ID that says use ridge for this paragraph here, but none of the other paragraphs specify that. And indeed, this is the only paragraph that should, by HTML rules, have the ID of use ridge. Following that, we have another tag selector on the image tag, and here we see the border style, solid, border color, and border width 150%. Actually counteracting this rule here. And there we see the result of this on this image tag here, and on the one that follows here. This markup is a little bit different. We'll account for the different appearance, and we'll review that in a moment. Our next selector is attribute selector, and here we have it on an anchor tag. So the target is calling out an attribute of the anchor tag. Now that attribute could have any setting because it's not specified. So any anchor tag with this attribute, this will be selected with this style. Background color black and color white. So here we see an anchor tag, a link to the original source for our bicycle article here, and you can see background color black and foreground color white. The other thing is that it gets big here when it hovers over it, and that's our last example here. It's also an attribute selector, but this attribute has a specific setting. So this would not, if there was multiple anchor tags with my attribute on this page, but they had other attributes other than big, that would not apply because this is an attribute selector with a specific setting. Again, this is an attribute setting. That is, this attribute has to be present. Don't care about its specific setting. This attribute has to be present, but we do care about its setting. And in this case, it's also a pseudo attribute. So it has a hover class, the state of the thing. So as I hover over this thing, this anchor tag becomes extremely interested that I press it. And when I do, I link to the Wikipedia article on bicycles. And this is an interesting article. There's something here down here, firefighting bicycle, that caught my attention. And also, I like the look of recumbent bikes, but I think they're dangerous. So the next time, we'll look at the HTML file and see how the CSS is called out in index.html to get the look that we have here.